Welcome to Around the Empire. I'm your host, Joanne Leon. This is a fully independent podcast. Now more than ever, independent media needs the support of listeners and viewers. Visit the website aroundtheempire.com to find out how to support the podcast and gain access to the bonus content. There are both audio and video versions of the show that you can find on various platforms. In most cases, the video version has some added maps and image enhancements that you may want to check out if you're interested. Giorgio Cafiero joins us today. We talk about the upcoming elections in Libya, scheduled for December 24th, 2021. The situation still remains chaotic and uncertain, with just a few days left. And to quote Giorgio in one of his recent articles, quote, "Libya is at a delicate point in its history. The deeply fractured and divided North African country has the first round of presidential elections officially set for December 24th, yet we do not know if the elections will be held that day. Whether or not elections are held then, and whether the second round and parliamentary elections are held in February will matter significantly. But more importantly, how various domestic and foreign actors act in the period following the elections matters even more." In a bonus episode, we talk about the possibility of Libya being integrated into the broader Arab world and possibly become one of the countries who normalize relations with Israel. And we also talk about the main candidates, Haftar, Ghaddafi, and the interim Prime Minister, Dbeibeh. Giorgio Cafiero is a Washington-based analyst and CEO of Gulf State Analytics. He's a regular contributor to many media outlets, an adjunct fellow at the American Security Project, an affiliate at the MENA Center, and an analyst at London-based advisory Rosa and Rubini Associates. Giorgio Cafiero is here with us today, speaking to us from Washington, D.C. Hello, Giorgio. It's great to see you again. Thanks so much for coming back on the show.
Thank you. It's good to be back with you.
So we're going to talk about the Libya elections today and some broader topics as well. But based on the headlines that, I've been roughly following the commotion, if you will, over the elections. And based on the headlines today, there's so much going on that I'm not sure how much time it's going to take to talk about this, because it's a moving target also. So people listening and watching, keep that in mind. What we talk about today could change tomorrow. So it's been 10 years since the Libyan war, since the overthrow of Muammar Gaddafi, and Libya has been under the control of an interim government for a period of time. And on December 24th, there is an election scheduled, and they've been preparing for this for a long time. There's been many candidates who submitted, and there's a lot of dispute. So basically, if you would, I think it's probably a good idea to just give a little background on, how we got the state of affairs in Libya, how we got to this point where they can't even have an election, and maybe a little background on the election process as well.
Absolutely. So as you mentioned a moment ago, there was the Libyan revolution a little more than a decade ago. Back in 2011, there was a revolt against the government of Muammar Gaddafi, which had been in power in Libya since 1969, and with some outside military intervention, mainly on the part of NATO members, chiefly the US, the UK, and France, as well as some countries in the Gulf. There was an overthrow of the Gaddafi government back in 2011. However, the toppling of Gaddafi's regime did not exactly happen smoothly, nor did it lead into some peaceful or democratic period. At least it hasn't as of now. So there was a lot of violence, a lot of terrorism after Gaddafi's regime collapsed. And by May 2014, the problems in Libya ended up erupting into an all-out civil war. And this civil war basically lasted from 2014 up until 2020. And in this war, at the risk of oversimplifying things too much, because there were more than just two sides, but again, we're looking at this from sort of a 30,000 foot level. There were two main power centers in Libya. One was the Tripoli based Government of National Accord, or GNA, which, from the United Nations perspective and the perspective of most Western governments, was the quote unquote legitimate Libyan government. However, in the east, the part of Libya near Egypt, in Tobruk, you had a different government called the House of Representatives, or the HOR. HOR was aligned with the Libyan National Army, LNA, that was basically a group of militias and fighters that were under the command of General Khalifa Haftar, who fought to overthrow the UN recognized government in Tripoli. And in early April 2019, Haftar's LNA, with the support of some foreign actors, launched an all-out offensive on the Tripoli government. And for a while, observers actually believed that his forces in the LNA were on the verge of toppling the GNA administration in Tripoli. Then we got to late 2019, early 2020, and there was direct Turkish military intervention that proved to be an absolute game changer. Just to be clear, Turkey was against Haftar, and Turkey was on the side of the GNA. And so basically, pro-GNA militias in Libya benefited from the entry of Turkish drones into the conflict. Not only were the pro-GNA forces able to prevent Haftar from taking over and conquering Tripoli, but they actually pushed his forces back east very far. I think, if I remember correctly, at one point, Haftar's forces were something like 5 to 10 miles outside of Tripoli, and yet this anti-Haftar counteroffensive pushed them several hundred miles east. And what happened as a result of this, I would say, a very successful counteroffensive, was that Haftar and some of the external actors, including the United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, and Egypt, who had been backing him, came to the conclusion that a continuation of warfare was not going to work out well for them. And they realized that Turkey is a force to contend with in Libya, and that Haftar had failed to achieve an all-out military victory. And so at that point, Haftar and those supporting him from outside of Libya agreed to enter into sort of a new period of diplomacy. And basically, in the summer of 2020, the violence of the civil war came to an end. It's basically been about a year and a half since we've had Libyans killing each other. Now, this does not mean that the conflict was resolved, but we can at least say the conflict was frozen, and there was a period for diplomacy to kick in and for there to ideally be a settlement to the conflict. So October 2020, there's a ceasefire that's agreed to. Then in the spring of this year, the HOR in the east and the GNA in Tripoli are, at least on paper, replaced by the GNU, Government of National Unity, which has had an interim prime minister. His name is Dbeibeh, and he used to be a Ghaddafi regime official. And throughout this whole year, there's been this very fragile and very tense peace in Libya with this interim government in power. Now, the big date that you mentioned that we've been spending months and months thinking about is December 24. This is the date that Libya is supposed to have, or was supposed to have, presidential elections. And the GNU, this interim government that came to be earlier this year with support from the United Nations, has its mandate and its legitimacy ending the 24th. So the plan is for Libya to elect a new leader, and ideally this leader will have democratic legitimacy. He will be someone who can lead newly unified Libya. He will have presumably come to power through the first election in the North African country's history in which there was really universal suffrage. And there are many Libyans who have concluded that this has to happen, and that holding this election on December 24th is a critical event in terms of the country's democratic development and the democratization of Libya. However, there are many good reasons to question whether or not this election would be able to achieve any of those positive outcomes. Not only are there concerns that the election would fail to bring peace and unity to Libya, but there are also concerns that holding this election could have the opposite effect. And because of many divisions in Libya, as well as many unresolved questions, these elections, according to some people, including many Libyans, risk reigniting the civil war. To begin with, these elections are taking place without any sort of constitutional basis. The Libyan people have not even had a referendum on a constitution. There is also much debate about who can be considered a legitimate candidate in the country. There are some Libyans who say, look, you got some candidates running who have committed war crimes in Libya. Their crimes against certain Libyans put them beyond the pale. Then there are other Libyans who say, well, democracy is democracy. If those are the candidates that the most number of Libyan people vote for, then shouldn't the Libyan people be able to decide to have one of those men as their leaders? There's also so much uncertainty surrounding questions about what kind of power the president would have. So the Libyans don't really even know what they're voting for. And like I said, there's no real constitutional framework for this election to take place. There are also extremely valid concerns about voter intimidation and how there could be violence that prevents the election from being held in a manner that could even remotely be considered free or fair. And right now, we still don't know the official list of candidates. And this election, well, the rules that were set up for this election dictated that the Libyans would need to know who the candidates are at least 2 weeks in advance. This way, the candidates would be able to campaign. Right now, well, very recently, just before coming on your show, we got the news that the decision to finalize a list of candidates has been delayed. And now we're within 2 weeks of December 24. So there's some serious concerns right now that this election won't even be held. And if it's not being held, then we're going to immediately have a period of time in which there's a government that probably a good chunk of the population will see as completely illegitimate. And how all of this is going to play out on the ground, we don't know, but there's good reason to fear that the election, or perhaps absence of election, could trigger violence and possibly, under the absolute worst case scenario, reignite that civil war that basically froze in the middle of last year.
You could see how people would sort of be on ice for a while, all right, let's see how this election process works out. And yeah, I hadn't really thought about the fact that it could, instead of bringing some more calm and order, it could actually trigger a worse civil war kind of situation. The obvious things like one side's the person they back doesn't get elected, and now they've got no potential. And like you said, I did not realize that this wasn't based on any kind of constitution, or the interim government is the UN appointed government, right?
Correct.
And the parliament in the East, the House of Representatives in the East, did they solidly back this election? And this, you said it's a shaky situation with a unity government. It was a shaky situation to
Mhm.
begin with, but did everybody agree on these elections and some basic rules? Was there any kind of
Unfortunately not. There have been many divisions throughout the country, and just to be clear, the East-West divide is very, very far from being the only political division in Libya, even though I think we can safely argue that it's the most important and most relevant one. But no, there has not been a consensus and about any of these fundamental issues. And there are certain groups in Libya who, quite frankly, do not want to see the country democratized. They do not want to see this election happen on December 24th. They would not want to see an election happen probably any time in the foreseeable future. There are some actors in Libya, including those who are still loyal to Haftar, who realize that they would probably not ever win at the ballot box. And
mhm,
just to rewind a little bit, put a little more context there, the vast majority, at least the majority of Libyans, do not live in the east, in the areas that the LNA controlled. Most Libyans live in the western part of the country. In the western part of Libya, there is a lot of hatred for Haftar. What happened during his 2019 offensive on Tripoli served to create a lot more division, a lot more vitriol, and contributed to many grievances that Libyans have. It's just simply, if the election is even remotely fair, it's just unimaginable that Haftar would win. And so, like I said, there are certain actors in the country, such as some militias that are loyal to Haftar, who would, they don't have an interest in seeing this election happen. And I think they, along with some others, could definitely try to play sort of a spoiler role in this scenario. Some of these actors see the path to power being through bullets and not ballots. And I think we need to be pretty clear-eyed about that. And then at the same time, we need to take stock of the fact that we don't just have Libyans on the ground in Libya. Around Tripoli, you have a big Turkish military presence. As I mentioned, in 2019, 2020, the Turks intensified their military intervention to prevent Tripoli from falling to Haftar. Well, the Turkish military footprint remains in the country. Also, you have the Wagner Group, which is a Russian mercenary organization that, according to some sources, has, believe, around 2,000 of its fighters still on the ground in Libya. And of course, these foreign actors have a lot of influence. They have a lot of power in sort of the ways that they're going to act, depending on what happens or what doesn't happen on December 24, is going to be really critical to keep an eye on.
I saw a number mentioned that there are 7 million, the population in Libya is around 7 million, and that about 3 million have registered and gotten the voter cards and such. Does that mean that about half the population is not of voting age, or do we know how much of the population intends to participate? Any sense of that?
Yeah, a while ago, maybe I think about a month ago, the number of Libyans who were ready to vote was just, I believe, above 2 million. Things gone up since then, if I understand correctly. It seems, yeah, obviously there's a age requirement, so you have a chunk of the population that's not old enough to vote, and some that don't see anything that can be gained from voting.
Mm.
Not all Libyans believe that it's in their interest to take part in this process.
The election process itself, polling stations and such, I assume that it's going to be run by some type. I know there's a commission,
Mhm.
but I assume that there'll be international involvement of the UN and international observers and such. Do we know anything yet about maybe
Yeah, so
that's too much in the weeds?
yeah, this is another issue too. There seems to be a lack of international organizations to monitor and observe the election. And it's very problematic because if it's easier for certain individuals or groups in the country to claim that there was fraud or to claim that there was a rigged vote, whether that's true or not true, if that becomes sort of a popular narrative, that can
Yeah.
really undermine the legitimacy of, this elections and the outcome of the election. We're here in the United States, so we can't exactly act like these are issues that only exist in Libya. But it's very dangerous if you have a big chunk of the population that doesn't view the election as legitimate, and without enough international observation, without enough international observers on the ground. That's definitely a very serious risk to consider.
Yeah, I mean, I guess you can see how it would be harder to get observers because it's a dangerous place, right?
Absolutely.
But on the other hand, we've got so many world leaders and others uh, preaching about democracy. You would think a country in its very first democratic election that they would go out of their way to help. Just my comment on that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. There, are certain countries out there that I think want to see this election happen. There are others that are not so keen on seeing any sort of democratic process taking place anywhere in Libya or in the region. But the United States has been very adamant that the elections need to go ahead and that this date, December 24, is very important. It seems the British have a little bit of a different position, sort of voicing their concerns about what could happen if this election is held on December 24, but the country is not prepared to have the election by that time. So, there's definitely some different perspectives that Western governments have. But yeah, I mean, to your point, though, this has been a long road to achieve democracy in Libya. I'm frankly quite pessimistic about what will happen on December 24 and after December 24. But you're absolutely right that those who have spent many years talking about democracy in this country should definitely try to be doing more to help the Libyans have an election in circumstances that enable the votes to happen freely and fairly with the sufficient amount of security. But again, given all of these factors that we've talked about, it seems like a very, very gloomy situation as Libya is currently in this very, very, very difficult and sensitive state of limbo.
Yeah. So let's dig a little bit more into the influences on Libya. One of the most concerning things for me, one of the most confusing things for me is that there were always so many hands in all the different situations and events in Libya, from the NATO intervention, coup, overthrow, whatever you want to call it, from that, and ever since, there have been regional powers who have their own interests and either are physically in Libya, have militias or troops, or sending money, and there are a number of them, some closer than others, some fairly far away, some it just seems like this country's been, not that it didn't always have, it was a country of division. We always knew that. Gaddafi with an iron fist was able to keep it together, but there's some question as to whether this can even remain one country. But it feels to me like it's been a free-for-all for other countries to get in there and sort of tear this place apart, or try to get their bit out of it. Let's talk about, there are a lot of players, and I mean, I've even heard stories about some countries being on both sides, if you will, or more than one side. There are stories about special operations forces, operating on both sides of certain conflicts. But let's talk about some of the main players. who are operating or exercising influence over Libya. And, who's got the most influence? Um, Maybe, bring the election into that. Are they backing certain candidates or other things? And, what are their goals? We know, money and power or resources are always a goal, but I think it's even more complicated than that in this situation. Some regional powers have some other interests. So I realize that this is a complex question, but if you would try to untangle that and explain it to your best of your ability for us.
Yeah, well, you're absolutely right that the violence in Libya has not just been about problems that Libyans have with some other Libyans. That, as you correctly mentioned, there have been so many foreign actors that have become involved in Libya in one way or the other. When the civil war was raging from 2014 to 2020, you had General Haftar, who was a strong actor in Libya, in large part because of foreign support that he received. I think his most important external backer was the United Arab Emirates. And the Emirati agenda in Libya needs to be understood within the context of the counter revolution, of which Abu Dhabi was really sort of the main patron, if you will. The UAE, ever since 2013, with the coup in Egypt that overthrew that country's first democratically elected president, Mohamed Morsi, the UAE has been pushing this counter revolution, trying to prevent democracy from taking shape in really any part of the Arab world, frankly. Why is the UAE so worried about democratic development in any part of the Arab region? Well, I think it mainly comes down to the fact that there is a fear on the part of the leadership in Abu Dhabi that if you had a country like Libya or Tunisia or any other Arab country that democratizes, there's a threat of a good example, and you could have more Arabs, even Arabs in the Gulf, demanding democratic reforms. If Libya were to ever become a country with a relatively free political system and successful, a strong economy with a lot of prosperity, that could become, as I said, very popular. And there are concerns that that could become a model that groups and individuals try to emulate throughout the region. The UAE is also very concerned about political Islam from the perspective of the regime in Abu Dhabi. There's not really any serious distinction to make between so-called moderate Islamists like the Muslim Brotherhood and then more violent extremist Islamists. It's sort of all the same, with maybe the face being a little bit different. But Abu Dhabi's view is that ultimately political Islam basically in all cases amounts to terrorism. And so if there were to be a democratic system in Libya, it's a safe bet that, even if Libyan Islamists would not dominate that system, there would be at least some power that Libyan Islamists have. And the UAE doesn't want to see Islamists consolidate or solidify power in an important country like Libya that has a large geography and has a lot of natural resource wealth, a huge Mediterranean coastline. All of this helps us understand why the UAE rather aggressively supported Haftar during the conflict. Now, UAE was not alone. Other actors in the region supported Haftar for reasons that were quite similar. Saudi Arabia is also a patron of the counter-revolution in the Arab world and was quite aligned with Abu Dhabi in terms of viewing Haftar as the leader who would be a bulwark against political Islam in Libya, or as officials in Saudi Arabia and the UAE would put it, a bulwark against terrorism. You also had Egypt, which has an anti-Islamist regime and also a fear of democracy in countries surrounding it. on its borders, democratizing. So the Sisi government in Cairo was an extremely important supporter of Haftar. Israel also shares the UAE's vision for a more, you know, authoritarian and militaristic set of regimes in the Arab world, definitely sharing many of Abu Dhabi's concerns about the forces of political Islam in the Middle East and North Africa, and not wanting to see democracy take shape in any of these countries. You also had Russia and France supporting Haftar. Yeah, Russia and France had different reasons for supporting Haftar. Um, for Russia, there is sort of a history of working with figures like Haftar that goes even back to the Soviet era, where there's sort of a tradition of the Soviets backing secular strongmen, figures like Hafiz al-Assad in Syria, and also the Soviets had a good relationship with Gaddafi in Libya. They had a good relationship with Nasser in Egypt. I'm not sure I would say they were allies with them, but definitely the Soviet Union had a partnership with Nasser. Today, in this modern period of time, in the post-Soviet era, Russia is trying to regain a lot of the clout which the Soviet Union once possessed, not only in the Middle East, but throughout many parts of Africa. Libya is a country where the Russians want to have a lot of influence. There's also a lot of synergy between Russia and the UAE. At the end of the day, we can say Russia is supportive of the counter-revolution as well. Russia does not want to really see space for civil societies growing too much in the Arab world. And whether you're talking about supporting the Assad government in Syria or supporting Haftar in Libya, this is something that we do see from Russian foreign policy, is a desire to sort of promote authoritarian stability in the region. That being said, Russia was never as one-sided as the UAE. So while Russia did support Haftar and the Wagner group did go into Libya to help him with his offensive, the Russians were always maintaining a dialogue with Tripoli. And the head of the Tripoli government even went to Moscow, met with Russian officials. So while Russia was one of the backers of Haftar, we should have a little nuance here when talking about how Moscow has dealt with Libya, definitely trying to hedge bets a little bit and be somewhat balanced. I also mentioned France has been a very important actor in the Libyan conflict. France has been supporting Haftar for a number of years. And it's very interesting, just I think it was either today or yesterday, the French were calling on the EU to impose sanctions on the Wagner Group / Russia for the Wagner Group's presence in Libya. But as one expert on Twitter pointed out, he said there are, many levels of hypocrisy to that, given the extent to which France has sort of basically been on the same side as the Wagner Group when it comes to supporting Haftar. But in any event, regardless of sort of the complexities of French-Russian relations and the French attitude of Wagner, the Macron government has been a supporter of Haftar. And this has to do mainly with French interests, not so much in Libya, but in the Sahel at large. And the Sahel is the part of Africa mainly made up of former French colonies. We're talking about Burkina Faso, Niger, Chad, so on and so forth. These are the countries in Africa where France has the most vested interests. And there's been a crisis with terrorism. You've had many groups linked to Al-Qaeda and ISIS who have been terrorizing these countries. And let's, of course, add Mali to the list, obviously an important country here. And France doesn't want to see these kinds of jihadist groups spilling more blood and destabilizing these countries. And if your listeners go to take a look at the map, you can see southern Libya is basically it is a part of the Sahel, and it's very interconnected with these different countries. And so the French concern was that if a terrorism crisis in Libya would spiral out of control, it could spill into those countries where the French have so many interests. And their calculation was that the man who's going to stop, who has the best chance of stopping that from happening, was Haftar. So France actually broke from pretty much the rest of the EU, while the rest of the EU members, let's put Greece aside, with the exception of Greece, all of the other EU members were officially supporting Tripoli, but France was supporting Haftar. So it created this divide within the West. And this divide has been one of the main factors that has prevented the European Union from being able to act on Libya with any semblance of unity at all. And as I mentioned, obviously the state that came in to really save the GNA during the Haftar offensive was Turkey. Turkey has its own reasons for supporting had its own reasons for supporting the GNA during the civil war. In large part, the Turks, they have gas interests in the Mediterranean. There's also some ideological factors with the government being Muslim Brotherhood friendly. There are other ideational factors in play too. And there's also the fact that Haftar was being backed up by Turkey's main rivals in the region, chiefly UAE, Saudi Arabia, and Egypt. So all of these factors gave Turkey stakes in seeing to it that Haftar would not become like the new Gaddafi, if you will. Turkey did not want to see Haftar controlling all of Libya. That certainly would have made Libya another country in the Mediterranean that was anti-Turkey. And there have been concerns in recent years on the part of officials in Ankara that Turkey is facing isolation in the Eastern Mediterranean. And so the thinking was having Turkey-friendly political order in Tripoli would be very beneficial to Ankara's geopolitical interests and also help to assert Turkey as a powerful country in the African continent, which has definitely been a huge goal of the administration of Recep Tayyip Erdogan. So there definitely are some other players who are involved, but I think if we go through the Gulf states, Egypt, Russia, Turkey, and France, I think that it gives listeners a good idea of probably the most influential and most powerful foreign states that have been so involved in Libya in recent years.
Now, Qatar is aligned with Turkey on a lot of things. Are they generally aligned with them on their position on Libya as well?
Yeah, definitely. So Qatar was at odds with the UAE when it came to the Libyan civil war, just like Qatar was at odds with UAE on so many different regional issues. And Qatar did align with Turkey very closely during when it came to Libya during the years of the civil war. And but it is important to realize, though, that Qatar's influence in Libya has been exaggerated by many. Mm-hmm. So during the 2011 to 2013 period, Qatar was very active in Libya. When the intervention was going on against Gaddafi, in fact, the Qatari Air Force was directly involved in operations against Gaddafi's government. And the Qataris certainly tried to make some serious soft power gains in Libya. However, when there started to be a period of chaos and a huge crisis of terrorism in post-Gaddafi Libya, Qatar's reputation suffered quite a bit. Whether fairly or unfairly, many Libyans began to associate their country's problems with terrorism with Qatar. The narrative was that extremists in Libya, like Islamists and jihadist groups in Libya, became so powerful because of Qatar's intervention. Maybe there's a whole other discussion to have about whether or not those allegations are rooted in fact or fiction, but in any event, that became a rather popular and widespread narrative. And so beginning in 2013, Qatar did quite a bit to actually back off Libya. It did not completely pull itself out of Libya entirely. It remained a party with interests in Libya, but it was pursuing those interests with a much, much lower profile. And it was really the UAE that became the Gulf state with the highest profile in Libya, really from 2000, I would say basically 2014 onward.
And just one last thing, China was doing a lot of business with Libya before the overthrow. Are they generally aligned with Russia and for the same reasons on Libya, or have they sort of held back?
It's very interesting, and that's a great question. You know, given how much China and Russia align on so many foreign policy issues, not only in the Arab world, but just sort of the world at large, one could be forgiven for just assuming that China and Russia have been on the same page in Libya. And although there have definitely not been any clashes between China and Russia on Libya, they've really had sort of different positions. China has embraced what we can sort of call strategic ambiguity. The Chinese view during the Civil War was that it's best to not get involved. The Chinese were saying, we don't know who's going to come out on top in this civil war. If you back one side, then you risk having serious problems if the other side wins. It's better just to sit back, let other countries take the risks of getting involved, let other countries waste their resources on this fighting, let other countries build up bad will among certain people in Libya, and just keep China neutral and make sure the Chinese role is non-controversial. China has very much been looking at sort of the long game. They want Libya to stabilize one day. They would like to see Libya be an important part of the Belt and Road Initiative. China obviously sees many ways to prosper and to make huge profits from investments in Libya. But when it comes to the messy politics, unlike Russia, UAE, or Turkey, the Chinese have not really been getting involved, and they certainly have not waged any direct military interventions in the country. Totally consistent with kind of the ethos of Chinese foreign policy decision makers is they view sovereignty as a sacred concept. They really, when they talk about Libya, they emphasize there need to be Libyan solutions for Libyan problems, and that Libya needs to solve its problems as a sovereign country. And that is, for the most part, kind of the main position that the Chinese have.
Yeah. I know sometimes they do tend to be a silent partner, as in like in Syria, but yeah, I can really see why it benefits them to just stay friendly with whoever comes out on top, because that's a prime piece of trade route and resource real estate.
Yeah.
And you know, people from the United States tend to, I shouldn't speak for everybody, but I'm pretty sure that like me, you know, Africa is a huge continent, and I'll put up some maps into this video for assistance. Africa is a huge continent. The Mediterranean Sea is relatively small compared to, I think that we tend to think of the continent of Europe and the Mediterranean Sea as these massive places, but really, if you just kind of like scale your map to like 500 miles, there's a lot of things within 500 miles of Libya. You know, you might say, like, why are these countries getting involved in Libya? Like, they're way over in some other area, but they're actually not that far. And there's a whole thing with the Eastern Mediterranean right now. Not only the potential for the Belt and Road initiatives and trade routes and such, but newly discovered gas, I think oil and gas, but mostly gas. And all of these countries, some of them with a scant amount of coastline, you know, so that whole issue. So, you know, it's great to hear you lay out. You did a great job laying out the different geopolitical interests there, and you know, and what they're what they're after, what their goals are. And the assumption is always the resources, the money and power, but you brought up a lot of other more nuanced perspective, which I appreciate.
Absolutely. Yeah. Big security concerns too. If Libya were to become a country where a good chunk of its land comes under the control of groups affiliated with ISIS or Al Qaeda. I mean, as you mentioned, I mean, there's so many countries within close proximity to Libya. It would be an extremely huge security crisis for Western countries, EU members, other countries in Africa. So there's so many parties that have such high stakes in the future of Libya.
And a key send-off point for migration, and of course the EU is always way high on their priority list. And things that really untenable situations apply, and really, anyway, it's just we'll stick to the interest right now. I won't go off on yeah, it's just a tragic situation.
Absolutely.
For so many reasons. Now we should probably roll over into the bonus question now.
Okay.
I just want to make sure that you feel like you've been able to say what you wanted to say on the topics we talked about. Okay.
Absolutely.
Now, so let's talk about Libya and its integration into the broader Middle East, North Africa region. We have talked offline about there are alliances, realignments, and things going on all the time. And I guess that always happens, but some big significant changes have been going on. And so who do you think that Libya could now become another state that sort of becomes a diplomatic partner, starts to normalize relations with Israel? How do you think that Libya might fit into this sort of realignment, and Arab states that are forming different alliances and normalizing relations with Israel? How do you think that might play out? Just, speak freely. Just give us your thoughts on this whole potential situation. Visit aroundtheempire.com to find the various ways that you can gain access to the bonus content, join the Discord community, and participate in the periodic Zoom calls where we talk among ourselves. I hope that some of you will join us, and now we'll continue with the wrap-up. Right. All right. Well, I've taken enough of your time, but if you would, Giorgio, please tell everyone how they can follow you, how they can find your work.
Absolutely.
And this kind of thing.
Thank you. My name is Giorgio Cafiero. I'm active on Twitter, and my handle is at GIORGIOCAFIERO, at Giorgio Cafiero. My company is Gulf State Analytics, and our website is www.gulfstateanalytics.com.
And you want to be following closely in the next couple of weeks to see how this plays out. Thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it. It was great to talk to you.
No, thank you. The pleasure is all mine. I really appreciate this opportunity to come back. And if you can just shoot over a link whenever this goes up, I'll definitely be sure to share this on social media.
Will do. Take care.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for listening. Special thanks to Giorgio Cafiero. Follow him on Twitter at Giorgio Cafiero. Find his work at gulfstateanalytics.com. This is a fully independent podcast. In this age of censorship, your support is more important than ever. Go to the website aroundtheempire.com to find the various ways that you can get access to the bonus content and support the show. Don't forget to like, share, subscribe, and leave reviews. Follow on Twitter at Around the Empire. Join us on Telegram, t.me/aroundtheempire, and we'll see you next time. Take care, everybody, and happy holidays.